Good evening. Welcome to Third Thursday from KWSU TV for October 23rd. With us today is the editorial page editor for the Lewiston Morning Tribune, Bill Hall, who generally has liberal opinions, and on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, who's a columnist with the Idahonian of Moscow, Idaho, and Daily News of Pullman, Washington. Well, Doug, what do you have for us today?
It is quite obvious that South Africa is a troubled region, but it is perhaps not as obvious that its principal difficulty can be found in the fact that liberals the world over have decided to help out. This fact by itself should be enough to frighten thinking men everywhere. Potential recipients of liberal do-goodery have long since learned to run for cover. But there's a larger concern with this latest liberal undertaking. Why is the horizon so limited? They have fought long and hard to get civic rights for the blacks in South Africa. But why just South Africa? If one takes the time to scan the rest of that unfortunate continent, one discovers an incredible vacuum when it comes to human rights. Why did the liberals not press the president to slap sanctions on every country south of France? The answer appears to be that liberals think that blacks don't mind being oppressed by other blacks, but that they rise up indignant when the whites do it. There's really no way to understand this except as a form of racism. The question needs to be asked, does the color of the oppressor matter? If we have heeded what liberals have been telling us for years about bigotry and racism, the answer should be no. The objective observer of the political scene should consider this as a true curiosity. Do liberals object to the mistreatment of blacks? It depends. They have to ask a few questions first. Was the atrocity committed by blacks or whites? Was it done in the name of revolution or reaction? So then, liberals are being selective in their indignation. Why do they not call for sanctions against every country where blacks do not have the vote? The answer appears to be contentment with a real double standard. Bill?
Well, I'm not surprised at that. I would remind Doug that liberals, like blacks, don't all eat watermelon and tap dance. They are many diverse opinions. I've never met one with the opinion you just attributed to them, but I want to congratulate you on a wonderful straw man, a white one at that. Indeed, why not clamp down on everyone? I was of the opinion that our government, with everyone cheering, had divested the hell out of Libya and Gaddafi.
Bill, Doug, any comments on that?
Certainly. I guess I drew my supposedly erroneous conclusions from the fact that liberals have been raising Cain in Washington, D.C. to get sanctions applied to South Africa and nowhere else in Africa. Do we really want to disinvest from every company that has work in a country where blacks do not have the vote? And then once we do that, do we want to go on to areas where whites do not have the vote and Orientals do not have the vote? Do we really want to do to the rest of the world what we have done to South Africa for the same reasons? If so, then why? If not, why not?
Well, what we have done to South Africa, yes, we want to do that to the rest of the world. What we have done is more a negative thing than an active thing. What we have done is said, we don't want to do business with people like that. If the man on one side of you beats his family and drinks himself to sleep every night, but has a better business than the man on the other side who's pretty law-abiding, which one would you want to go into business with? Well, maybe you'd prefer the money.
Well, let's put it this way. I think that it's truly a news-making event that you're calling for sanctions against the Soviet Union. Is that right?
Yes, I am calling for sanctions against the Soviet Union on their treatment of Soviet Jewry. It's the same thing exactly.
So we shouldn't have American businesses in the Soviet Union. We shouldn't have American businesses in communist China. We shouldn't have American businesses in most of Africa. We shouldn't have American businesses in most of the Middle East. We shouldn't have American businesses anywhere except Western Europe. Is that right?
We should apply pressure wherever this sort of thing is going on. You apply different levels of pressure depending on whether the situation is gelling nicely. It is partly the art of the possible. You take your shots where you find them. But yes, indeed, we should maintain pressures on various nations around the world, and we do, indeed.
Should it be greater pressures or lesser pressures if the atrocities are greater? In other words, is it worse in the Soviet Union or worse in South Africa?
I think it's worse in South Africa, but that has nothing to do with it. This isn't a matter of being slightly pregnant. If it's wrong, it's wrong.
Oh, I agree with you. If it's wrong, it's wrong.
Don't agree with me. That's disgusting.
It's about time for a slightly pregnant break here, I think, and then we'll hear from Bill Hall with his comments and give Doug Wilson a chance at him right after this message. Okay, and theory.
That was wrong, by the way.
Why?
We're supposed to just break.
Well, South Africa was on the mind of Doug Wilson. What's on your mind today?
Glenn, what's on my mind is something I heard Senator Steve Sims say this week. It doesn't look like much will happen this week, said Senator Steve Sims, explaining why he was home in Idaho campaigning instead of tending to business in Washington. And in one sense, he's right. Though a lot was happening, apparently none of it would be decided by one vote, so he wasn't strictly needed. Nonetheless, history called his name last week and there was no answer. For the first time in half a century, the Senate was obliged to do its duty and remove a federal officer, Judge Harry Claiborne, from office. An impeachment proceeding was in full progress, and 97 senators, many of whom are also up for re-election this year, considered it their overriding duty to be present and not home kissing babies. They saw it as what it was, not just another vote, but an historic right of institutional importance. When a federal judge abuses his trust, is convicted of a crime, and ends up in federal prison refusing to resign, that is a thunderclap. That is a thumb in the eye of America. That is an affront to the nation requiring Senate action. And it is a melancholy task to be done together, everybody present and carrying his share of the sad weight, no slackers, nobody hiding in the washroom, no one home campaigning for re-election. This wasn't just another special interest bill, just another trivial proposal to declare the 12th of July National Pickle Day. A man who had tarnished a public office and defied the nation sat before the Senate as only few others have in all our history, and the Senate dealt with him. One by one, the names of the senators were called. One by one, they were asked a pointed question from out of the past, a question written by great men intent upon protecting the government of the United States from internal rot. How say you, intoned the President pro tempore of the U.S. Senate, is the respondent, Harry E. Claiborne, guilty or not guilty? Guilty, Mr. President, responded one senator after another. Not guilty, said a handful. And how say you, Mr. Sims? Mr. Sims? Mr. Sims? Mr. Sims?
Well, was Mr. Sims out in the bus in Moscow and Doug Wilson was close behind, or what?
Well, I wasn't close behind, but about the only thing I'm surprised about this is the fact that the Evans forces haven't accused Senator Sims of skipping out so that he could smuggle grapes in from Oregon on the campaign bus.
We now call that wine eyewash.
I think I agree with you that the impeachment proceeding is a very important one, and I think that Senator Sims would like to be at the next one. And since he would like to be at the next one and still be a member of the Senate, at that time he had better be doing some hard campaigning because he is in a race for his political life, and I think it would be better for him to win the election and represent Idaho well in the Senate rather than to go over the cliff with all his flags flying, casting an unimportant vote. If the vote were a close vote or an important vote, I agree with you, he should have been back there. But it wasn't that important. It was not going to be settled 51 to 49, and Senator Sims had more important things to do.
I can see why a man who was in the fight of his life, the polls show it neck and neck, figures he has nothing to lose to take the PR loss and come back to Idaho and kiss babies and slap backs. On most of these votes, I can see that. But on this one particular vote, there's a terribly important symbolism here. This is one of the major ways our checks and balances work among the systems, one of the ways we cleanse this system and have made it so robust these past 200 years. Symbolically, this was an important thing, and 97 senators agreed. Senator Slade Gorton of Washington, for instance, broke away from his campaign, which is equally close. I think Senator Sims screwed up this time.
I think the best thing you can say that you're saying that he committed a ceremonial faux pas, yes, which is different than saying that he missed out on an important vote or a crucial vote. 999 Idahoans out of 1,000 don't even know who Federal Judge Claiborne is and don't care.
Oh, I don't agree with you on that. They're better well read than the readers of your paper are, but much better read, I should say. But this is something I would think the senator would have wanted to have been there. It was a dramatic and historic event. It's the whole reason you get elected to the Senate, to go play important.
I'm sure he did want to be there. I'm sure he would desire to be there, but I believe that he wanted to be there for 6 more years, more than he wanted to be there symbolically for the 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the roll call.
There's no doubt that the senator wanted election more than anything else.
And we'll want to come back here in just a minute We'll start throwing out some hot topics for Bill Hall and Doug Wilson here on Third Thursday. Time for some topics here on Third Thursday with Bill Hall and Doug Wilson. Doug, I'm going to start this one with you, the Iceland summit. We hear from the Democrats that President Reagan lost a tremendous opportunity to limit nuclear weapons. And the Republicans are saying Reagan stood up to the Russians. How do you stand?
Well, I think he did lose a tremendous opportunity by going in the first place. He lost an opportunity to score a PR victory over the Soviets. He walked into the summit, and like other conservatives, I'm glad that he didn't give away the store. I'm glad that he didn't budge on Star Wars. I'm glad that he didn't compromise at all on SDI. But he walked right into it, led with his chin, let the Soviets walk away, blamed the failure of the summit on him and his intransigence, and I think it was a PR error, but I don't think any historic opportunities for arms control have been lost at all.
Bill?
Well, I'm going to take that always dangerous tack, a pox on both their houses. I'm pretty cynical about this. Both Gorbachev and Reagan said within the week something again about one day soon, perhaps if this comes together, doing away with all missiles. I don't believe that. I don't believe they believe that. I don't want that. I don't. If you disarm, that's total disarmament to do away with all missiles in a world where Pakistan might have one or Gaddafi might have one someday, or some other nations. Do you really seriously believe the Soviet Union and the United States are going to do away with all their missiles in a world where other nations have them? I think in a more hopeful vein, the best that can come out of this is that we will get rid of some of these expensive things, that we will recognize, as I think both of these men are, the principle of overkill. And these systems are pretty expensive to maintain, you know, replacing and taking care of these critters that we want to throw at each other.
And one of the best ways to get not entirely rid of these missiles, but to limit their number, is to implement a strategic defense system so that the missiles become superfluous. All the overkill capacity becomes superfluous. Now, I agree with you that we don't live in a perfect world, but if we don't live in a perfect world, far better to have a defensive system that works than an offensive system that works, and you only have a balance of terror.
I'd love to have a defensive system that works. It's too bad this isn't one of them.
Why are the Soviets so scared about it?
Well, I'll tell you what I really think, and I don't know is the answer to your question, but what I think, what I suspect, is that they fear this economically, as should we, but they more than we. Each new level of escalation in armaments is prohibitively more expensive. You know, what was a World War II fighter plane? $30,000, $40,000. What's a fighter plane today? $22 million.
Mm-hmm.
When you start going up the next level, you can't have guns and butter. I think Gorbachev wants butter, and Bill Hall wants butter, and I'm not sure we can afford that either nation.
Let me see if I understand this. SDI is a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle that won't work,
Mm-hmm.
And besides, if we build one, the Soviets will too.
I don't
because
know.
it won't work.
Well, it may or may not be a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle. It's multi-billion dollars for sure on both sides, and I don't think either economy can stand that without a lot of strain. I think it will lessen the standard of living in the United States of America and in the Soviet Union. I think it will damage the economies of both countries. It's self-destruct time, folks.
Besides, it's 10 years away. We've already heard that. Here's another topic. Bill, we'll start with you on this one here. Nuclear waste. With all the talk about nuclear waste, we've had truck accidents, one near Burley here just recently. What's the best way to handle nuclear waste?
Well, again, I'll tell you, I don't know, but I think I do know this. It's not just a matter of nuclear waste. I don't see most of these low-level nuclear waste as especially more dangerous than a lot of other things trucked across this country and brought by train across this country. It's clear in one accident after another, some of them rather severe in some communities, we need a better policy of what kind of vehicles can move what kinds of materials when. We're just waiting. It's just a matter of time before we have some really serious problem in some large city, probably not involving nuclear waste.
We do need good safety regulations for the transportation of nuclear waste, but we also need some good education of the general populace as to what nuclear catastrophes are possible and what catastrophes are impossible. Many people have a totally erroneous view of what can happen in a reactor, a totally erroneous view of what radiation will do to you, a totally erroneous view of the whole question, so that when some accident happens, everybody is not only in danger, but they are in danger of doing the wrong thing because of their ignorance. And that ignorance is perpetuated by the anti-nuclear lobby.
Well, as a general rule, I think it's a good idea to have two people on either side get together and bash ideas together, and you kind of come up with the truth somewhere in the middle, as we're doing here and now. But there's no place where that works more poorly than in the nuclear debate. You have some hysterics on the anti-nuclear side, and you have some utterly complacent fools on the industrial side of that. And nothing scares me more than to have somebody at Hanford say, nothing can happen here. That scares the hell out of me. I can just hear pipes cracking when they say that.
Should we store waste at Hanford?
Well, I'll go along with those who believe it should be a scientific decision rather than a political decision. And my meager grasp of that issue is that Hanford has some problems, and there are other places that do not. But if Hanford turns out to be the safest and best place for that sort of thing, then that's where it should go. But it should be a scientific decision, and it clearly isn't so far.
Sure, it should be a scientific decision, and I think one consideration is we ought to store it in a place where if there were a nuclear accident, you couldn't tell, say Nevada.
Almost too much agreement here right now, so let's get into another topic. 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. I've heard, and I've actually read some columns by Bill Hall, who said that the most terror that ever came to him was actually riding with Jay Shelladay in his car, traveling probably more than 55 miles per hour. But do you think we should have this speed limit of 55 miles per hour? Congress right now is talking about raising it to 65 on rural interstates. We'll start with Doug Wilson, though, first on this one. What do you think? 55 miles an hour good, saves energy?
Depends. Depends on where you are in the country. It depends on whether you're in town, out of town. But in the West, in between cities, where you have a straightaway, there's absolutely no excuse for a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. It is, I won't say criminally insane, but it's just crazy. You ought to have it be at 65 or 70 on these selected stretches of highway. Other places, it ought to be 55, 45, whatever safe driving will allow. If you don't do that, many people are going to drive 65, 70 anyway at the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and what has happened is that you're encouraging and winking at a disrespect for the law. I believe everybody, when they see a speed limit sign, ought to respect the intelligence of those who put it there. And when you're out in the middle of Wyoming or you're out in the middle of Nevada and you see a little 55-mile-an-hour speed limit sign, it is pretty difficult to respect the intelligence of the people who put it up.
Well, first of all, people are going to drive 5 or 10 or 15 miles beyond whatever the speed is, and you increase the speed limit, you're just going to increase the level at which they break the law.
But at least you ought to have people when the state police pull someone over, they ought to be pulling people over for driving unsafely. If someone is driving 10 miles an hour over the 70-mile-an-hour speed limit, he is driving unsafely, he ought to be stopped. But a man who's driving 58 miles an hour is not driving unsafely.
Well, I'm always amazed that people assume that there's only danger if there's another car involved. If you have ever sat next to some of the drivers I've sat next to, and what about the passenger? Would you agree that you shouldn't be able to drive over a certain limit out on the open Nevada desert if you were, unless you were alone? You have the right to kill yourself out there?
If you were entirely alone, I think even out in the middle of the Nevada desert, there are speeds that are unsafe, and you ought to have a speed limit sign. But 55 is not that speed.
What do you think that unsafe speed is?
Out in the middle of Nevada, 70, 75.
I think it's 60. I think we're in too big a rush. We need to stop and smell the roses before some of these crackpot drivers and have us all pushing up posies.
I've never seen roses in Nevada in the desert.
That brings up another point, though. How do you feel about this congressional proposal? A congressman from New Jersey has proposed that he wants fuzzbusters outlawed if we raise the speed limit.
You cannot, without interfering with people's civil liberties, make it a crime for them to be in possession of things that are not in themselves criminal. Fuzzbusters would be an example.
What other purpose does it have?
That's none of the government's business.
I take it that you were also against doing away with drug paraphernalia, outlawing drug paraphernalia.
I am against convicting someone simply on the possession of drug paraphernalia.
You would not have closed the drug paraphernalia stores.
Now, I don't think the government has the right or the obligation to step in and say you are in the possession of certain things that could be used to commit a crime. That's like convicting a man for burglary because he has a screwdriver and a crowbar.
Glenn, I don't understand these crazy permissive liberals.
I think we ought to go to another topic like drug testing. Do you think there should be drug testing of, say, editorial page writers at the paper or federal employees, state workers? That's been a pretty hot topic lately.
I think there should be drug testing only when it is blatantly apparent that the performance of this person's job affects the public safety. Other than that, I think we ought to respect people's privacy.
Examples?
Airline pilot. But not editorial writer. You would wreck most editorial writers if you took them off alcohol, at least. Or at least coffee.
The problem with drug testing is that people have confused the public sector and the private sector. The government has no business stopping citizens on the street and searching their body for drugs without a search warrant, and they shouldn't have a search warrant without reasonable cause being shown to a judge who issued the warrant. But if a private industry wanted to make as a condition of employment that all employees must undergo drug testing, it doesn't matter if that employer is the National Football League, Holiday Inn, Burger King, it doesn't matter. It's their company, and they have the right to have a drug-free environment in the workplace. And if someone doesn't want to submit to that test, they don't have to apply.
Do they have a right to hire employees who don't own fuzzbusters?
Yeah, that's right.
Let's hit another topic, sex education. Here's another one that's been quite a bit in the news. Number of teenage pregnancies have been happening. How can we not justify teaching sex education in the classroom?
Very simple. We can justify not doing it because the rise in teenage pregnancy and the rise in teenage sexual activity has been in direct proportion to the amount of sexual education that's been going on in the schools. If you said that when we institute sexual education in the schools, then these teenage pregnancies go down, and if you could show me one place in the country where that has happened, where a sex ed program once instituted worked, then I might be willing to listen to it. But what we find is that sex ed taught in the public schools is taught by virtue of the fact that they are public schools with a hands-off approach to basic morality. So it becomes a mechanical course. This is how it works mechanically, and there is not the element of morality taught along with it. And when you have that information given to the kids without the morality being instilled with the information, the kids don't know how to handle it.
I always thought it was, you folks thought it was rock music that caused these frenzied young folk to go into heat.
No.
Isn't that the records played backwards?
Yes. No, I think, as a matter of fact, I believe there are some studies, I think one out of Oregon, showing that the greater the amount of sex education, the fewer the teenage pregnancies.
Okay, the less the sexual activity of teenagers?
I don't know about that. I haven't accompanied them out into the back seat. That's for you ministers to do. You're the window peepers.
The problem with that approach is that you cannot look at the overall increase of sexual information. No generation has been better informed about how to avoid pregnancy than this generation.
I'm surprised that a man of your neatness and breeding would think that ignorance is bliss in any realm.
No, I'm not saying ignorance is bliss. I'm just saying that if you're going to teach sexual education, then teach all of it, including the morality that goes along with it.
Whose morality?
God's.
Oh, I'm sorry. You speak for him and I don't. I only speak for newspaper publishers. They do get mixed up on occasion.
You cannot avoid moral questions. You cannot live in a society without addressing moral questions. You can't educate children without moral questions. And if you try to educate children without moral questions, you are not truly educating. So you either have a hidden morality of your own, a secularist morality, or you don't impose the morality or teach the morality, in which case you're not educating.
Yes, but there are facts and there are facts. When you educate them to the fact that, that it takes a sperm and an egg, nobody disputes that. When you're talking about whether polygamy is a good idea or whether it isn't, those are moral judgments.
That's right. And that's why I think all this shows that the public school system is hopeless, and the only way you can educate with moral conviction in a way that does not impose on the rights of the minority who do not accept that morality is to have your educational system be based on private schools.
How come you people want the prayers in the schools, but you don't want to keep the sex education in the churches?
I don't want prayer in schools, in the public schools, because I don't want kids in the public schools.
Well, I don't
want creation in the public schools. I don't want anything in the public schools. I would like a bunch of empty hallways.
I don't blame you, all this immorality they're teaching.
Yeah, that's true.
You teach sex education in the private school, where you're at?
In the private school that I'm associated with, we are willing to teach sex education in conjunction with the parents, but because of the nature of the school and the grades that we have, it's not been an issue yet.
Last one here, DWI laws, reduced liquor consumption. There's been a study, I think, in the Tri-City Herald here a while back that said because we've had tougher stance on DWI, liquor consumption's down the past 5 years. Do you think the enforcement has been good?
I think the enforcement has been good, but I don't think you can just grab one thing out of many factors and say that was it, as Doug is so fond of doing, is deciding that it was sex education instead of rock records in this case. That's the same game you're playing. That may have had something to do with it. The economy of the state may have had something to do with it. The weather may have had something to do with it. The evangelistic movement's growth may have had something to do with it. There are 200 factors I could think of. And to point to one and say that was it is silly.
I think cracking down on DWIs is a good thing to do in spite of any ability to prove that it has any deterrent effect. In other words, deterrence does not have to be proved before you crack down on someone who gets out on the road drunk. Every DWI...
like Fuzzbusters, it involves public safety, you can do it.
If someone has a six-pack in the trunk, do you arrest him?
No.
He might get drunk with it.
No, I don't. You don't arrest people on might.
All right, so you don't arrest people with Fuzzbusters.
Yeah, but a
booze
beer
would
is
be
good
their
for
own
only
right,
one.
though,
A beer can be used legally. A Fuzzbuster can't. I mean, booze can be used for a legal purpose. A Fuzzbuster can't.
I think you underestimate the creativity of the American people.
You think they would drink a Fuzzbuster? I don't understand that.
Let me interject something here. I don't think it is justifiable to use a Fuzzbuster in order to avoid the speed limit. I think citizens ought to obey the law. I think they ought to drive 55 as long as that speed limit is legally set. I think we have an obligation to do that. So I'm not defending the use of a Fuzzbuster, but I am saying that simply because someone is in the possession of an object that some people think can only be used for one purpose, maybe the fellow's returning it to his friend, maybe he's doing this, but if he's drunk on the highway, he is a clear and present danger.
It was, well, you just watched Third Thursday. Join us again in November for Bill Hall from the Lewiston Morning Tribune, who represents the liberal side, and Doug Wilson, the conservative. I'm Glenn Johnson. Good night from KWSU. Good evening. Welcome to Counterpoint here on KWSU Television, featuring two prominent writers from the Palouse. Bill Hall, the editorial page writer and columnist for the Lewiston Morning Tribune, and who generally represents the liberal side. And on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, the Idahonian in Moscow and Daily News of Pullman, Washington. Since Counterpoint is a new program, we'll explain how the format works. We'll open up with commentaries by each gentleman, and there'll be some response. After that, we'll open up the opinion grab bag. But first of all, Bill.
How true it is that teenage boys in their naive romps through passion tend to recklessly make teenage girls pregnant, but how true it also is that naive Christian conservatives tend to become accessories to illegitimate pregnancies. Indeed, you could build a case for the contention that mature religious leaders are, in many ways, more responsible for the pregnancies of teenage girls than are teenage boys. After all, babies are caused less by wicked teenagers in the backseat of Chevrolets than by religious zealots in the backwaters of pragmatism, refusing to arm youngsters with the prophylactic of sex education. To be sure, we are talking in both instances about decent, well-intentioned people. We're talking, on the one hand, about adolescent males and females acquiescing to the commands of their seething glands while unprotected by the practical knowledge that will save them from their love children. On the other hand, babies born to children are caused not just by frisky teenagers, but by sanctimonious old ostriches with their heads stuffed into the sand in the empty, untutored hope that the kids will get married before they begin their on-the-job training in sex. Most ministers understand that, and most parents. Most normal human beings of 10 or so have experienced overheated glands at times. We all have our little romantic meltdowns in and out of wedlock. We all understand these matters. We all know that life is a constant struggle against pleasure, and especially if we're lucky enough to be married, a whole series of blessed surrenders. But most of us also realize, for the sake of children that might be, that we cannot all manage to be as well-informed and as severely disciplined in these matters at 17 as our romantically atrophied but staunchly superior old moralistic ministers at middle age. Just as there is a minority of young men who care too little about whether they impregnate their nightly prey, so too is there a minority of religious zealots who care less about how many kids get witlessly pregnant than about how full the offering plate is after they scare the fornicating hell out of the congregation. So it is true that it takes two to produce a pregnancy. It takes fertile children, and it takes these prophets of chronic premeditated sexual ignorance. Perhaps you can't keep your frisky teenager away from other teenage romantics, but for the sake of your premature grandchildren, keep your kids away from these careless conservative ministers who believe that ignorance is bliss, but that sex isn't. Doug?
Bill, I think the problem is that a half-truth presented as the whole truth is an untruth. The issue is not whether you oppose or support sex education. The issue is whether you oppose or support partial sex education.
And pray tell, what is that?
All right. Partial sex education is mechanistic. Partial sex education simply tells the children, teenagers, how to avoid getting pregnant, how to conduct themselves sexually. It says nothing about their responsibility as sexual beings. It doesn't make moral judgments. That kind of amoral presentation is a partial truth presented as the whole truth. So it's not that we object to information or knowledge, and it's not that we're advocating ignorance. We are opposing a partial truth presented as the whole truth.
I don't know a sex education program in the country, in the public schools, that doesn't teach some responsibility.
Responsibility on what basis? Why? What for?
Avoiding pregnancy before marriage, avoiding pregnancy before you're old enough to care for the little nippers.
And why is it that all these children going through these sex education courses are cheerfully paying no attention whatever to this generic moral responsibility that is being inculcated in the public schools?
Why is it you can make up these facts that they aren't?
Well, you're the one that pointed out the problem that we have with all these pregnancies. Did these pregnancies show up before or after we had massive sex ed in the schools?
Did they show up before or after we had television? There you go again, trying to
post hoc,
coming up with one explanation out of 5 million for something that's happening. Surely you don't believe a child is better off unarmed with some information on what makes his plumbing work.
I said that before. I don't object to children being armed with information. I object to them only being given part of the information.
I suspect the other part you want is to cram your moralism down their throats.
You bet.
That's a misdemeanor in 4 states.
Supporters of public education in America have never really settled one thing. It doesn't seem to be bothering them any, but it does bother me. The question is, how can we justify a massive governmental program of education and reconcile it with freedom that we enjoy as Americans? If we take a pluralistic society and we say that everyone has a right to believe and think and speak as he pleases, how can we reconcile that freedom with the requirement that we send our children to 12 years of compulsory education? The issue can be seen very clearly if you talk to an average newspaperman and ask him whether or not we ought to have government control of the press. He will say, certainly not. Have you lost your mind? If the government controls what we read in our newspapers, then we've lost our freedom. Well, how is it that the newspaperman objects to government control of what the average citizen reads 15 minutes every evening and does not object to governmental control of what our children read for 12 years all day long? It seems to me that there's a little bit of an inconsistency. If we see the threat to freedom when the government controls our press, why do we not see the threat to freedom when the government controls the education that our children receive? It wouldn't make things any better for the government to say, oh, we're not going to shut down free newspapers. We're going to simply sponsor a government newspaper that we're going to give away free. The private newspapers can sell their product. That, too, would be seen as a threat to freedom. Now, the thing that we need to consider is this. Do we have the right to, in a free society, to force people to believe as we believe, to think as we think? We see that threat when we're talking about the freedom of the press, but we don't see the threat when we're talking about our children. If the newspapermen object when their freedom is potentially threatened, they are somewhat like a man who has just been mugged and had $500 taken out of his wallet, and who then objects and puts up a fight when the people ask for his pocket change. Why are we squawking about freedom of the press when we've already lost the freedom to educate? Bill?
Well, first of all, there are many newspapers available. There are only a few school systems, but education is more important. Schools are more important than newspapers is one answer to you. You can take a newspaper or leave it. It's strictly voluntary on that basis. But I'd like to know that the brain surgeon who worked on me, and I'm sure you think he should, is truly certified and has not just gone to one of your whoopee Jesus schools.
Now, the problem here is you seem to be saying that the more important something is, the more government should be in control of it. Is that right?
There's a great deal of truth to that. I mean, we talk about traffic lights. Not getting killed in a traffic accident is more important than what I read in my home, and so therefore the government does have police powers. The government does have a role in assuring me that my child is getting a good education and certifying education.
Okay, there's two questions here. One, you seem to be preferring security to liberty. That's the first point. The second point is that you seem to have a real trust in the government to do a job it has proved itself incapable of doing over many decades.
Well, there are occasions where we do forfeit liberty to security. One of them is allowing our sons to be drafted, for instance.
Do you believe that the government has done a good job of teaching our children to read, or have they done a poor job?
I think they have done a better job than the competition.
Then why does the competition have consistently higher grades on national standardized tests? Why do the private schools do so much better?
The private schools are going up against an overall average, putting them up against the top students in the public school system.
Okay, well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that the private schools are producing whoopee Jesus brain surgeons on the one hand.
Wait a minute, I don't think they are. As a matter, I think the private schools are doing a very fine job, but they are required to by government. There are certain standards that are enforced, and that's what you're bellyaching about. You want the right to lower the standards.
No,
you want a lot more Jesus and a lot less whoopee.
The standards in a free society are not enforced except by the parents. The control of education should rest with the parents, not with the government. The children belong to the parents, not to the state.
It's time for our grab bag section now. Topics that have come up in the news, and let's hear what Bill and Doug have to say about these topics? We'll start with Bill on this one. Drug testing employees whose jobs are high security has been viewed by many opinion pollsters as being widely accepted. And yet when it comes their turn to be tested, they cry invasion of privacy. Should drug testing be banned or done at all?
Well, I think you can warrant drug testing for people in jobs that affect the public safety, such as airline pilots, bus drivers, people like that. That drug testing should include alcohol, of course.
Agree, but one additional comment, it should also be permitted in an area where a private employer desires drug testing because he wants his workplace to be drug-free. Private employers have that right. Of course, the drug testing there would not be used in any criminal trial. You're not rooting out criminals, then prosecuting them. It's simply a condition of employment.
He just doesn't want to be around those filthy people.
Well, no, he just doesn't want to, for example, he doesn't want employees that don't work as hard as employees who are sober would.
How about if he doesn't want employees who aren't Baptists?
This is a free country.
It's a free country. General Motors, if they wanted to, could hire nothing but Baptists.
As a Baptist, I'll break in right now and get the next question here. Is Washington being too idealistic in trying to make employees pay back wages in regards to comparable worth? Doug?
Well, comparable worth is a crazy idea in the first place. They shouldn't be requiring it, and they certainly shouldn't be requiring it retroactively.
I don't know how you can legislate such things. We're about to find out in the state of Washington, but we know what's going on in this society. Any man doing a job that you and I would agree is comparable to a job a woman is doing is generally paid not more, but a lot more. And I don't think you can legislate this sort of thing with any refinement, but perhaps you can make a stab at it, and that's what the state of Washington is trying. I'd like to see them prove me wrong.
If you legislate something like that, all you're doing is legislating envy. People go into a job freely, and they agree to work for a set price, set wage. If it sounded good to them at the time, it has nothing whatever to do with the case if Jones or Smith across the street is making more money for the same job. None of their business. It's a free country.
It has to do with justice. If somebody is twice as good at her job as you are at yours, makes half as much, that ain't right.
If she's twice as good at the job, then she can say, hey, I'm twice as good at the job, pay me this amount.
You can say, get lost.
Well,
that nobody else will pay you.
An employer doing that is cutting his own throat if she's twice as good at the job. The market works. Freedom works.
Okay. Now, next question for you. TV evangelists, should they be tax-free as they gather this money in to...
I think you have to err on the side of the First Amendment. If they are merely evangelizing, as long as they stay in the preacher business, if they wear $900 suits and live in a $100,000 mansion and pay property taxes on the mansion, I would leave their company alone. If their company, of course, starts producing jockey shorts or something like that, then that company that is owned by them should be taxed.
That is true. You should leave churches and religious organizations tax-free because the power to tax is the power to destroy. We've seen that power executed against the American populace in general, and I don't think we want to expand the taxing powers of our government at all. We should not only preserve the freedom that these TV evangelists enjoy, we should perhaps share that freedom with the general rank and file.
I'd tax them only when they're in competition with free enterprise. In the case of Jimmy Swaggart and some others, they might be in competition with Hollywood, but I really wouldn't go that far.
Okay, Idaho seems to win a lottery. Will they eventually get one, or is it economically unfeasible, Doug?
Well, they may get one. As I understand it, the anti-lottery forces are planning to challenge the whole thing in court, and I'm not at all sure how it's going to come out of the judicial process. But if it passes the judicial test and we come up with the possibility of a lottery, I don't think it is possible for Idaho's lottery to compete with Washington's. I don't think the numbers are there.
It's not going to succeed in the court test. It was little noticed that in an Idaho Supreme Court decision earlier this year on whether it should be on the ballot, they said it should be on the ballot and then we'll deal with it. There was a 3-2 opinion against this method of amending the Idaho Constitution. But the legislature will just put it back through again, submit it to the people properly. That's the way an amendment is supposed to be handled. And then it will become a lottery. But of course, Idaho's population is so small, the prize will be about $1.37.
Here's another question, Bill. Farmers are hooked on subsidies. With Reagan trying to live within a budget, will the farmers have to go cold turkey, so to speak?
No, I don't think cold turkey. I think you have to have some sort of a grandfather clause on that sort of thing. If you go into just a wide open free enterprise farm system overnight, that's kind of breaking the faith of the people who went into farming on a given basis. I worry less about that than about how we sort out the farmers who deserve to go under because they're bad businessmen from those who have been caught up in times and situations, high interest rates that they truly couldn't do anything about. Free enterprise should sort out the bad performers, and it's sorting out more than the bad performers right now.
We should be deeply suspicious of the government's attempts to help people, particularly when the problems the government is trying to solve are problems the government created. I also agree that you can't bail out of the farm subsidies overnight without causing severe dislocations. But you have to go out quickly enough to cause some dislocation, because if you stay in, you're simply going to compound the problem over and over.
Okay, Doug, I'll ask this one of you. With the recent problem in Nicaragua, the Hassenfuss trial, are we nearing another Vietnam involvement? We're already sending some Contra aid. What's our situation there?
Our situation there is potentially another Vietnam, but liberals who are so fond of talking about the lessons of Vietnam have not bothered to learn the lessons of Vietnam. The fundamental lesson of Vietnam is that you don't go and dink around in a war that you have no intention of winning. You don't go fight a war where you have no objective, no clear policy objective. That's the lesson of Vietnam. You don't go fight for 10 years, kill 50,000 Americans and Lord knows how many Vietnamese and accomplish a big goose egg. That's the lesson of Vietnam. Ronald Reagan has a clear policy objective in Nicaragua, and that's to get the Marxists out. It is a fine policy objective, and if we show resolve in what we do there, we're going to avoid another Vietnam.
That's the fuzziest clear policy objective I've ever heard. I don't think he and the Secretary of State agree 2 hours in a row. What really concerns me about Nicaragua is the broader situation of our trying to butt into every civil war all over the world. We should have learned in Vietnam that we don't want to be too quick to do that.
So we want to stay out of South Africa too, right?
We want to stay. We've gone into this before, my friend. When you pick your shots, if there's a chance of toppling Daniel Ortega the moment it is ripe, and I can contribute through a speech or editorial to that cause and replace him with someone better than he is, I will. That isn't the situation now. Your dear president is considering replacing him with some of the militaristic throwbacks that preceded him.
And who's going to replace the white South Africans if that government topples?
That remains to be seen.
Yeah,
they could not be any worse, could they? I suspect it will be someone that I don't like and somebody that you will dislike a lot more.
Do you honestly mean to say that you don't think South Africa can get any worse?
Yes, it's a lack of freedom. You know, it's the white folks denying freedom to the black folks. If you have black and white folks denying freedom to black and white folks, that would be terrible, but it would be no worse. Well, from your perspective, I suppose that if you had the black folks ruling the white folks, that would be a cataclysm.
There's a big difference between not having the right to own property or vote, which is oppression, and which I am opposed to the economic.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that.
I am opposed to the economic oppression. It's just how you deal with it. But there's a difference between saying you can't own property in this particular area, which is a mild form of oppression, and killing people left and right, which is what happens under communist dictatorships. Sure, it could get a whole lot worse in South Africa.
Oh, now, come on now, Doug. Killing people left and right happens under all kinds of dictatorships. That's why they call them dictators, because they take away your life and liberty without due process of law. Hallelujah.
Well, okay, let's hit this one here, Bill. Abortion is a woman's right, at least what the National Organization of Women say. Yet there's an increasing faction on the right that says otherwise. Is it a woman's right?
I'll tell you, the older I get, the more I don't know the answer. And I see Doug's getting older than I am, older a lot faster than I am. But I know in my own heart that there's nothing wrong with aborting an undivided fertilized egg. I know in my own heart there's a lot wrong with aborting a 9-month fetus. And where do I draw the line? I don't know. For lack of a better answer, the Supreme Court's answer must come close. And until I'm dead sure what's right and wrong, I'm going to butt out of that woman's life and leave it up to her, her doctor, her minister, and her conscience.
The problem with that is that that response, although it has the appearance of the appearance of humility, we don't know. Why don't we just leave it up to the principals
You ought to try
involved?
humility on, I don't know.
Why don't we
Of course,
leave it up
God
to the
doesn't
principals
talk to
involved?
me. I'm alone in these matters.
Well, the reason we can't do that is because that approach begs the question. The whole issue is whether the unborn child is a person with legal rights. Now, to say that why don't we just leave it between the woman and her doctor begs the question of whether this child has a stake in the discussion. If the child has a stake in the discussion, then we ought to hear what they have to say. But if the child does not have legal rights, then then that's fine. But we have to settle that question. We can't plead ignorance and say we don't know, so therefore we're going to go this way. We have to say, because we don't know, we ought to err on the side of the sanctity of human life. Now, that's for those who don't know. Those who do know that human life begins at conception are in a better position. They say, well, we protect human life from the point it begins.
Well, let's say we do know medically that a child is going to be mentally retarded or have some kind of genetic disease.
If we know that, then if the logic that says we know that there's going to be a deformity, if that logic is allowed to play its course before the child is born, why not allow that logic to play its course after the child is born? Why don't we go through old folks' homes and kill people off that are vegetables? Why don't we kill off people who are mentally retarded but
Because the
already born?
question is when a fetus becomes a person and when it is just a person that could be or might be.
Yeah, but the fundamental question is who determines? How is this decision made? Now, is the Supreme Court
Well, indeed, who determines if it's just a fertilized, undivided egg, and we will have the ability to detect that one day soon if we don't have it already, would you make it against the law to abort that egg?
I would have it against the law.
We'll call it Chester, if that makes it easier. Chester egg.
We'll have it against the law if I had my druthers to have abortifacients, morning after pills that prevent the implantation of a fertilized egg, because everybody that's listening to this program was once a fertilized egg. I was once
a good egg in my case.
I was once a 2-year-old child. I was once a 1-day-old child, and I did not have the potential of becoming what I now am. I was the same person, and that continuum goes
getting back to
all
what I
the
said in the
way back.
beginning, you were a person, and an egg is not a person. You're never going to make me or 90% of the people in this country believe an egg is a person.
Okay, so
even if
when
you give
does
it a name.
So when does it happen?
I don't know.
All right, so
When does it happen?
okay, it happens at conception.
Okay, it's Chester egg then.
Well,
El rest, okay, so.
Okay, Doug, should children with AIDS be allowed in school? Of course, I realize this would never happen in private schools, but what would happen?
children with AIDS should be cared for by people surrounding them. They ought to be supplied with an education. They ought to have all their needs met. But there is a major hush-hush going on about AIDS because people don't want, the people in authority don't want the general populace to panic. And consequently, they are, I believe, being a little less than truthful about everything that we know about AIDS transmission, or rather about the things we don't know.
Well, that's paranoid, but my answer is that you should, it has nothing to do with AIDS. It has to do with disease in general. Any disease that is likely to be transmitted from one child to another, society has the right to ask that that child be educated at home or in some good Christian school that will take the poor little nipper in. Any child that does not have a transmittable disease should be able to go to school, and that everything I can read includes AIDS.
We're in agreement there, but because of the association between AIDS and the homosexual population, it has become a political football and not just a medical question. If you're dealing with influenza or measles or something like that, you can address the question scientifically and not have pressure groups howling about discrimination. With AIDS, it's different, and I believe that our public policy is so sensitive to the accusation of discrimination that we are not approaching the question as scientifically as we would if it were a measles epidemic or an influenza epidemic. We're not being as rigorous with the facts.
Well, we should run in terror from witch hunts and scare stories. I don't agree with that.
Bill, how did the American government's lying about planned attacks on Gaddafi affect American credibility overseas?
Well, you mean where they admitted that
They admitted they had had some
they had fibbed about it? Well, that sounds like a real cute tactic. But actually, it sounds like something out of the Young Republican Club at Stanford. They used to call it in the Young Republican organization rat-loving, let's call it. It's play dirty tricks on the opposition. That sounds like fun to me when you're doing it to Gaddafi, but the problem is the next time we put out information on something happening like that and it is true and we want people to believe it's true, they're not going to believe us. It just destroys your credibility all the way around.
I believe that this credibility gap that the press is so upset about is kind of humorous. I think it was probably a strategic or a tactical mistake rather than the part of the Reagan administration to try something like that. But to see the media so upset about it is funny. I really think they need to get the log out of their own eye. I'll never forget the time I saw Sam Donaldson one time on TV during this DebateGate thing. Did Ronald Reagan steal Jimmy Carter's debate papers? And Sam Donaldson was pressing the president, well, it may have been legal, but was it right? And you knew that Sam Donaldson would do the same thing in a flash.
Let me make a deal with you, Doug.
If he got a leak, or if the papers had been given to him.
Let me make a deal with you. You don't ask me to answer for Sam Donaldson. I want to ask you to answer for Jerry Falwell.
All right. That's a deal.
Okay. This might be very timely. Religious fanatics have gone too far in their campaigns against the rock and roll industry. At least that's what some people say. They say they're also carrying on campaigns with pornography and abortion clinics. But who is more radical, the left-wingers, the right-wingers in this particular, in terms of campaigns about the rock and roll industry, pornography, and abortion? Doug?
Okay, I assume that with the rock and roll industry, you're talking about the labeling of records and that
Possibly
sort of thing.
that, and maybe playing records backwards.
Okay,
we'll get messages, you know.
If freedom has died because people have been asked to label the records simply to let people know what's inside, then freedom is dead at the box office, because we've been rating movies for years and it hasn't seemed to produce any Gestapo-like tactics that I've been able to see to ask people to put some indication of what you're buying on the outside of the label is simply, I think, reasonable. The attack that is being levied against pornography and against abortion and against the excesses of the rock culture are counterattacks. They are not people suddenly deciding to mind everybody else's business. They are people who have had their worldview under assault for several decades and have finally had it up to here and said, well, we're going to defend ourselves, we're going to defend what we believe in, and we're going to point out some of these things. So it's largely a defensive maneuver, people trying to preserve a way of life that is under increasing assault.
I believe in truth in packaging on movies and on records, especially when dealing with children. I don't believe in censorship in any shape or form, but I believe you should be required to label whether it's violent or sexy so people can stay away from it if they choose.
If you don't believe in censorship in any shape or form, then why does your newspaper have a letters policy reserving the right to not publish certain letters? Isn't that censorship?
Yes, it is. I'm not talking about censorship specifically. I'm talking about censorship generally. It depends on what kind of publication you're putting out, what kind of publication you have the right to put out. We choose to put out a general circulation newspaper. We have the legal right, but not the moral right to cram porn down their throat, so to speak. But Playboy
so that's a private policy.
It's a private policy.
Okay. I remember correctly, they're done.
I would say that one of the reasons that we are beginning in Pullman is because the issue of pornography many times is not considered as essential and as great a concern as it should be. And because we have become aware of it, we have begun here. And we feel this is propriety. We should begin within our own community. I would like to draw your attention and remind you that from time to time throughout the comments that were made against this proposition, that we were diverted over again many times from the issue of children to the issue of adults. And the issue before us is the issue of children. And another statement I would like to make is that it was purported by the young lady who has just gone out of adolescence that it is not the responsibility of parents to govern the direction in the speech of their children and what they see. I suggest to you that it is. And I suggest to you that it is your responsibility. And I believe that another question I would like to come to is the question has been asked repeatedly, who is to make this ordinance. I believe that this community can, in consultation with you as our council and with the community, we can come up with an ordinance that can be spoken to and be worked out. And I think it is our responsibility as well as yours to develop such an ordinance. Another comment was made that the things in our community are high on the shelf. And I suggest to you again, as my wife did, that my 11-year-old daughter can reach anything within any store in this town. And high on the shelf is not enough. Thank you.
Okay, council, questions? There are none. Sir?
My name is
Have you
Mayor.
signed up? Yes.
What's
Did you
that?
sign up to speak?
I signed up, yes.
Okay.
My name is Jim Wilson. I live at 114 South Howard in Moscow. However, I'm here as I've been the pastor of, one of the pastors of the Community Evangelical Free Church in Pullman since 1972, and first came here to open up a bookstore, One Way Books, and I'm the executive director of the corporation that owns the bookstore at Northeast 1002 in Colorado. So I live one place, but my primary activity has been here in Pullman for the last 14 years. I'd like to comment on a couple things. My wife and I, for the last 13 years, have conducted life between the sexes classes here in both university towns. And we've encountered an awful lot of things. I'll bring up just one example. And I know you don't prove things by examples, but this one disturbed teenage girl came to me for counseling, and she just volunteered this information that she and an acquaintance, a boy, teenage boy, were looking at a pornographic magazine together, and after they went through the magazine, she said, "Let's have sex." So they had sex. They had no other relationship with each other than the prior communication in the magazine. I can give many other examples. One of the other things that hasn't been touched on today, and that is